The entire executive team stood up and walked out in the middle of my presentation, leaving me alone in the silent boardroom. Their smug smiles told me I was finished. So I picked up my phone, called one person, and said 2 words: trigger it. This is the moment my entire career was put on the line, and you won't believe the fallout. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence of the executive boardroom was deafening. My voice, which had been passionately explaining the financial viability of Project Nova, echoed uselessly off the polished mahogany table. One by one, they had stood. First, Trevor Vance, our CFO, who checked his watch with an exaggerated sigh. Then Sarah Jenkins, head of marketing, who shot Trevor a conspiratorial glance. Then the rest, like dominoes falling, until I was left standing alone at the podium, my presentation frozen on the massive screen behind me. I was physically ill. For the past 3 days, I'd been running a fever, fueled by stress and a nasty flu bug. My hands were trembling, and not just from the humiliation. I had poured 2 years of my life, my health, and my sanity into Project Nova. It wasn't just a project, it was the company's lifeline, a way to pivot us back to relevance. And they had just walked out. Trevor, the last to leave, paused at the door. "This is over, Lucy," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "We're done funding your little fantasy." The door clicked shut, sealing my fate. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. I sank into the nearest chair, the room spinning. The humiliation was a cold stone in my stomach. I'd worked with these people for a decade. I'd covered for Sarah when her campaigns failed, and I'd found the data to make Trevor's budgets look good to the board. And this was the thanks. I replayed the scene in my mind, the smirks, the whispers, the pre-planned, theatrical nature of their exit. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was an execution. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Julian Croft, the company's co-founder and lead board member. He had been unavoidably detained and couldn't make the presentation. The text was simple: well. My fingers, still shaking, typed a reply: "They did it, just like you said they would." I took a deep, shuddering breath. I felt sick, weak, and utterly betrayed. But as I looked at Trevor's empty chair, a cold spark of anger began to burn through the fever-induced fog. They all thought I was just a passionate, slightly naive innovator. They thought I was a pushover, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who my mentor was, and they had no idea what Julian and I had been working on for the past 6 weeks. I had dedicated my life to this company. I started as a junior analyst, working my way up to director of innovation purely through results. I skipped vacations, worked weekends, and poured my heart into saving a legacy company that was drowning in its own outdated practices. Project Nova was my brainchild, a disruptive technology that would secure our future for the next 20 years. Trevor Vance, our CFO, hated it. He was the CEO's nephew, a man who believed in spreadsheets, not vision. He saw my project as a financial black hole, a drain on resources he wanted to allocate elsewhere. But it was worse than that. Trevor had his own pet project, a high-risk, speculative venture he had personally invested in and, as I would soon discover, had been secretly propping up with company funds. He wasn't just trying to kill Project Nova. He was trying to liquidate its assets to cover his own looming disaster. His main accomplice was Sarah Jenkins, our head of marketing. She was all polished suits and sharp smiles, but she had the ethics of a shark. She saw which way the wind was blowing and had hitched her wagon to Trevor, the man she believed was the heir apparent. She had been the one planting seeds of doubt about me for months, questioning my financial literacy in executive meetings and accidentally leaking negative projections about my project. The walkout was the final straw. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of their betrayal. Then, I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and plugged my personal laptop into the projector. The fever, the weakness, it all vanished, replaced by pure, cold adrenaline. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this. I had hoped they would see reason. But hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. The turning point had come a month ago. Julian Croft, the semi-retired co-founder, had called me into his study. "Trevor is blocking your budget requests again, isn't he?" Julian was a quiet, observant man who had built this company from nothing. He saw Trevor not as a successor, but as a liability. "I don't trust him, Lucy," he'd said. "He's moving money in ways that don't add up." That's when we set the trap. Julian, as the largest shareholder and board member, had the authority to commission a private, independent audit. He engaged a top forensic accounting firm, keeping it completely off the company books. My job was to keep working on Project Nova, to act normal, but to feed every suspicious email, every blocked invoice, and every lost budget file to Julian's team. The walkout today wasn't my defeat. It was the final piece of evidence we needed to prove conspiracy. I didn't chase them, I didn't call them. I simply picked up my phone, scrolled to Julian's name, and pressed call. He answered on the first ring. "They're all gone," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "They think it's over." "Good," Julian's voice was grim. "Then it's time." 20 minutes later, an email alert hit the phones of every person who had walked out of my meeting. Subject: urgent and mandatory. Emergency board meeting and financial review. It was from Julian Croft. Attached was a summons to return to the boardroom immediately. They trickled back in, one by one. The smirks were gone, replaced by confusion and annoyance. Trevor stormed in last. "Julian, this is highly irregular," he blustered. "I have a company to run. We just made a hard decision regarding Project Nova." "You made no decision, Trevor," Julian said, his voice booming from the conference speaker I had activated. "You orchestrated a failed coup." "How dare you?" "Be quiet," Julian commanded. "Lucy, please present your findings." I turned to the screen where my Project Nova presentation had been. I hit a key, and it was replaced by a financial flowchart. "This," I said, pointing to a series of offshore accounts, "is where Project Nova's budget has been going. And this is the shell corporation you've been funneling it into, Trevor. The same one you are the sole managing partner of." The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah Jenkins went pale, her eyes darting between me and Trevor. Trevor, however, tried to bluff. "This is absurd. That data is fabricated. Lucy is clearly lashing out after her project was rightfully canceled." "Is it fabricated, Trevor?" I asked calmly. I clicked to the next slide. "Because this is the wire transfer you authorized last week, moving $2 million from our R&D budget to that shell corp. You coded it as severance and restructuring." "And this," I clicked again, "is the email from Sarah to you, dated 2 days ago, with the subject line walkout plan, detailing the exact order in which everyone would leave my presentation today to maximize her humiliation and ensure the board sees her as unstable." Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp. The other executives looked at her in horror. "She's lying." Trevor slammed his hand on the table. "She hacked my files." "I didn't have to," I said. The boardroom door opened. Julian Croft walked in, flanked by 2 people in sober suits, the forensic auditors. "Mr. Vance," the lead auditor said, "pursuant to an emergency vote by the board's ethics committee, your access to all company accounts has been frozen. We have found conclusive proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The color drained from Trevor's face. He looked at Sarah, but she visibly recoiled from him. The other executives, the dominoes, were now desperately trying to distance themselves. "We had no idea about this," one of them stammered. "Trevor just said the project was a financial drain." Julian ignored them and looked directly at Trevor. "You used this company as your personal bank," Julian said, his voice low and furious. "You tried to destroy our most promising asset to cover your own failed investments. And you did it by trying to humiliate one of our most valuable leaders." It was then that Trevor finally broke. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You did this. You've been spying on me." I stood up from my chair, the fever and weakness a distant memory. No, Trevor, I did my job. You were so busy underestimating me, you never stopped to think I might actually be smarter than you. You saw me as an emotional woman, a fantasy dreamer. You never saw me as a threat. I picked up my phone and held it up. While you were planning your little walkout, I was documenting your crimes. Trevor lunged for the phone, but the auditors blocked his path. Mr. Vance, I suggest you wait for your lawyer, one of them said. It was over. He had lost, and he knew it. Trevor Vance and Sarah Jenkins were fired, effective immediately. They were escorted out of the building by security, their careers in ruins. The following weeks revealed the full extent of Trevor's fraud. He had embezzled nearly $10 million. He and Sarah both face multiple felony charges. The other executives who walked out were placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of their complicity. Julian Croft stepped in as interim CEO. His first act was to call an all-hands meeting. He stood on stage, with me by his side, and publicly apologized for the rot that had been allowed to grow in the company's leadership. Then, he announced that Project Nova was being fully funded, effective immediately. He also announced my new title, Chief Innovation Officer, with a seat on the board. The room erupted in applause. The flu I'd been fighting finally broke that night. I had been tested, betrayed, and humiliated. But I stood my ground, I trusted my mentor, and I used my intelligence not just to save my project, but to save the entire company from the enemy within. The silence of that empty boardroom was a distant memory, replaced by the sound of my future beginning.